Well, hello, everybody out there in cyberspace. My name is Byron Borger, and my wife Beth and I own the Hearts and
Well,
Minds
hello,
Bookstore.
everybody out there
And
in.
we are so grateful that you have chosen to spend some time with us this evening. Our bookstore is in Dallastown, Pennsylvania, which is down in south central Pennsylvania. If you know where Gettysburg or Hershey, we're south of Harrisburg. And we've been here for 38 and some years selling books as an independent bookstore. So we're just thrilled that you have joined us tonight to meet Gina Dalfonzo, who you will meet shortly, and Karen Swallow Pryor, who is joining us to celebrate Gina's new book. Karen wrote the foreword, called The Gospel in Dickens, published by Plough Publishing. I'd like to tell you just a little bit about our store, about Plough Publishing, before we get to the guests that you really came to see. But I have to do this little sort of formal stuff in the beginning here. I want to welcome everybody, of course. We are glad you're here. There's a bigger than average turnout here. It gathers, it seems. Lots of people are interested in this, probably because of Gina and Karen. Plough is a great institution, has a great journal called the Plough Journal that you may know. Hearts and Minds has some followers. So we put ourselves together and we got ourselves a really nice event here. So we're glad. It's a launch party for this new book that releases today. I would tell you to make a toast of something Dickinsonian that he would have drunk if you'd like at home there. But we're going to celebrate and party a little bit to celebrate this release of this book. Dallastown is in south central Pennsylvania, as I mentioned. So we're in a small town. Our bookstore calls itself just a regular bookstore. We are Christian, so it is what people tend to call a Christian bookstore. But we've always been sort of baffled why many faith-based Christian bookstores tend not to carry traditional fiction, contemporary or older fiction. I mean, what could be less Christian than some of the great novels of the past? I'm reading a book right now by a guy named Alan Jacobs called Breaking Bread with the Dead, which is a line from the poet Auden, saying that we really share table, we share communion almost with older writers when we engage them, and that that's a healthy, good, sane thing to do. When they're explicitly Christian, the way people like Dickens would be, it's even more so. So we're a bookstore that's always carried both contemporary cutting-edge fiction as well as some classic older stuff that we wish in our heart of hearts would sell even better than it does. So we're glad you're here. We're enthused that you showed up for this. You know, the very first book we sold almost 39 years ago, the day we opened as a Christian bookstore, the very first book we sold was Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. And that was before the musical was out. And so we thought it was almost like a sign from God that this was going to be okay to sell significant classic faith-based literature and try to make a living as a Christian bookstore that incorporated some of those themes. Well, then Plough comes along as a publishing house, and we adore them. We're grateful that they set this up tonight. We're sort of your host, but they're really behind it. Plough Press. You may know Plough Publishing emerges from a faith community called the Bruderhof. German folks that came into North and South America in part to flee the persecution under the Nazis and others. And they lived together in community in a simple way that is in the tradition of the Anabaptists, you know, the Mennonites and the Hutterites. And yet they, like we here at Hearts and Minds, really believe in reading widely and using the best of world literature and interfaith interest to help promote the cause of Jesus. So they're a Christian community, the Bruderhofs, and Plough Publishing is a Christian publishing house, indie and interesting, but yet they publish all sorts of great stuff. We just got one of their books in this week, which looks at great poetry and then sort of spins it a little so you could see how to use those poems today. It's actually called Poems to See By. A comic artist interprets great poetry. It is a great book with all these illustrations by a graphic novelist writing about poetry. This is a great contribution to this sort of stuff that Plough does. They recently did a graphic novel of the Grand Inquisitor, the excerpt from Dostoevsky, of course. And so who does these kind of books? Plough is remarkable. One of the things that they've done, as you probably know, and certainly if you saw our book notes post the other day, you've seen the list of the series that Gina's new book is a part of. The Gospel in, and they have them on several, George MacDonald, Dostoevsky, the Gospel in Dorothy Sayers, They have this whole series, Gerard Manley Hopkins. They have one on Tolstoy. So these books do what Gina's book does for the Gospel in Dickens, which is the newest one in this series. We're selling them at 20% off. You can even order them tonight if you'd like. We'd be honored if you would do that. And that's sort of the point, is getting the book out there. And so Gina's going to tell us a little bit more about it in a moment. But I wanted you to know who Plough was and how excited we are to carry almost all that they do, and how grateful we are for this series, The Gospel In, and the new one, The Gospel in Dickens. In fact, we're so excited about this that Plough is going to give a couple away. And those of you that signed up for this event, you're probably with bated breath and waiting on the edge of your seats, because we were going to have a draw out of a hat. We were thinking of an old Victorian, hat like from Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, but it was just too complicated because we had so many. So rather than actually pulling them out of the hat, we developed this sort of arbitrary way to pick some winners, and we have the winners here in front of us. We don't know where they're from, and out of confidentiality, I guess we shouldn't say where you're from, although it would be kind of fun because we have people from all over the country here tonight. But get ready. Here I am going to read the winners from our drawing that we did just moments ago. And then everybody that's on this list of these free winners gets an autographed copy, autographed by Gina, that the Plough Publishing folks out of New York will send to you for absolutely free. So just for joining tonight in this little contest, let's give it up for these particular winners. Here you are. Stephen Morton, from wherever you are. Stephen, congratulations. Zachary Lee wins a free one. Charles Gain, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Geiger, I think it's Geiger probably. Charles Geiger. Amanda Font, and Nancy Kelly. So there you go, 5 winners that we drew from our fake Victorian top hat, for free copies. Anybody else now has to order them at 20% off from Hearts and Minds. But there, we're going to give you some free ones. Another thing we're going to do tonight, by the way, is, as time permits, take some questions from our audience. We know there's folks from all over here. Some are brand new. Some don't know anything about Charles Dickens. Some are real Dickens scholars. We know there's some amazing folks online here with us now. So if you have questions, no silly, doesn't matter how they are, as simple or as complicated as you want, keep it in the form of a question, of course. But if you'd like to type in a question, you can do that at Facebook Live. And then one of the guys up in New York at the Plough that's running this whole thing will feed them to me, and we'll pick a couple and we'll have some fun just doing some Q&A and some questions and responses from Gina and even from Karen, if you'd like. So we've given away some books. We've invited you to type in some questions as the evening goes on. I've got a friend named Steve Garber who's written some wonderful books. His last book is called Seamless Life. It's a collection of short essays. He's an essay in there on P.D. James, the writer. He has written about Charles Dickens on occasion too. And Steve often, when he's writing about literature, quotes a line from Walker Percy. And Walker Percy said, "Bad books always lie, and they lie most about the human condition." I think that's what makes a really good book, is that it speaks the truth, and the truth about the human condition. I think we know that as we explore books like Charles Dickens. Karen Swallow Pryor wrote the foreword to this Gospel in Dickens book that we're celebrating tonight. And Karen, as you may know, is a scholar, a professor, and has written widely about literature herself. Her very first book is a memoir we carry, which is just a brilliant idea. It's called Booked, and it's her life story, part of her story, all by different chapters of books she loved at different ages of her life as a child and a teen and a young adult. And as she tells her own story, she writes about Jane Austen or other authors that she likes. She has a book on Hannah More, the great writer and poet and abolitionist, great historical study. And the book that perhaps made her most famous here of late is called On Reading Well. We have it, in fact, right back here, On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books. She has a chapter on Charles Dickens there, in fact. And as we'll talk about later, Karen believes and helps us understand that through reading great books, through breaking bread with the dead, as Auden put it, we can actually grow in virtue ourselves. Well, Karen and Gina are old friends. They're writers, they're readers, and they collaborated on this book. So I would like to introduce Karen now, who is going to open our evening by introducing her friend Gina Dalfonzo. So Karen, if you could join us, if we were on a stage, we'd invite you from backstage to show up here, but if you could join us and tell us a little bit about introducing Gina, if you would.
Hello, it's so great to be here with all of you and all of you out there, wherever you're from. This is just really a special and exciting event. I've known Gina for, I think, about 10 years. And what's neat about our friendship is that we have really come along as writers together with another group of writers that we worked with. But our paths have followed sort of a similar trajectory. And so it's been neat to see Gina grow and as a writer and write more books. Of course, tonight we're here to celebrate her just released today book, The Gospel in Dickens. But Gina actually had another book come out earlier a month or so ago, Dorothy and Jack. It's a story about the transforming friendship of Dorothy Sayers and C.S. Lewis. There it is. She's, I don't know many who've come out with two books in such close proximity, but that was in the stars. And Gina's first book is One by One, Welcoming the Singles in Your Church, a different topic, but really an important one and near and dear to many that I know and love. In addition to writing books, she is a columnist at Christ and Pop Culture. Her writings have appeared numerous places, often at Christianity Today, also The Atlantic, Mere Orthodoxy, The Weekly Standard, First Things. And she's actually probably most famous, or I knew of her before I even met her for her Dickens blog. She really is a Dickens nerd and knows more about Dickens than I do. So I defer to her on all Dickens questions. Gina has a BA in English from Messiah College and an MA in English from George Mason University. And like me, she lives in Virginia. So Gina, congratulations.
Thank you.
Everybody
so
at
much.
home start applauding is what we would do if we were together here in the bookstore. Gina, congratulations.
Thank you so much. But Karen, honestly, I was going to say that I think you know more about Dickens than I do.
No, you do.
So I guess we could go back and forth about that all night, but I'm tremendously honored and was just so incredibly grateful to have you write the foreword for me, and also that you're able to do this tonight. Karen, as I think we all know, has many demands on her time and is very gracious with it. So I'm just thrilled to death to have her be a part of this. And so I'm also thrilled to death that today was release day, and it's just a wonderful feeling to get this book out in the world and get people reading and talking about Dickens.
So you run this Dickens blog. So to be sort of now doing a book curating and selecting the actual parts of Dickens that might illustrate things of his faith. I mean, this is a big deal. I mean, this really isn't just another little scholarly monograph about Dickens. This is a major work, and it's part of this bigger series that Plough has done. So it must feel pretty good. I mean, I'm very proud of you. It's exciting, huh?
Thank you. Yes, it's wonderful to have a book in this particular series. I just admire it so much. I have for a while now, and
are we allowed to ask this? How did that even come about? Did they approach you and say we need a Dickens scholar to do a book on in this series, or did you come up with the idea and say this would match the one they've done on Tolstoy and Hopkins and the other ones?
Well, it was really interesting how it happened. I was at a little bit of a loose end at the time, looking for a project to do, and as I said, I was aware of the series. And I had met someone from Plough at a writing conference some months before. And so it was in, I guess, March of last year, 2019, that I sort of put everything together and thought, I really think this series needs an entry on Dickens, and maybe I could be the one to do it if they would consider me. So I wrote to my contact at Plough and said, has Plough ever considered adding Dickens to this series? and the word was passed along the chain, and someone said, well, as a matter of fact, we are looking for somebody to write on Dickens. We really do want that. And so contact was established, and we went back and forth about it, and it was agreed that I could do it. So that was just a wonderful thrill, having them
Oh, good.
select
They
me.
knew it was the right thing to do. Yeah.
Yes.
Plough is so curious to me because, they are these Anabaptists that live in this community. The women wear long dresses and head coverings. They're not quite Hutterites or old order Amish, but for people that aren't familiar with them, it might conjure up some ideas of almost like the Amish. But yet their love of good literature, the devotionals they do, the poetry volumes they do, the magazine Plough is always just extraordinary. And they have got really good literary taste. For those that don't know the magazine, it is just called the Plough Quarterly, full color, really good. I think it was Phil Yancey that said it's the most important journal that he's reading right now. I mean, some really important writers look at it. And Karen, you're in it this particular quarter on how to read Dickens. So congratulations for that your foreword from this book is actually in the Plough Journal. That's pretty classy. So I'm with two really smart women. I need to stay out of this. So let's get started in earnest. I guess the standard question booksellers at book events like this, when you're celebrating a new book, like to say, is just to ask the writer, what were you thinking? Like, why did you want to do this? And we've already heard of your love of Dickens and being a Dickens nerd and wanting to do this great series, but why this particular book? What is it that drove you? How long did it take? Tell us just a little bit about this process of coming to want to do this book.
Well, my love for Dickens goes all the way back to high school. I touch on this in the book, actually. In 9th grade, when we read Great Expectations, we actually read an abridged version in my English textbook. And then I went to the library and got the full version because I thought, no way, I can't just stop there. I have to read all of it. As it happens, Great Expectations is actually one of the shorter ones of his books. So it was not too much of a challenge to start with that. And I just went on from there. Over the years, I've kept reading Dickens and just loving his work. And as a Christian myself, I've always been interested in the question of his faith. And there is some debate over that because for various reasons, there's some debate over, was he really a Christian, or did he just sort of use the trappings of the faith in his books? Was he a nominal Christian? Some of those reasons include he was very interested in the Unitarian Church for some time. So there are those who say he was never really a Christian. He only ever got as far as Unitarianism. And another reason is that he often had a quarrel with religious institutions and was always calling them out for not doing enough to help the poor, to really live out what they said they believed, and so forth. So for all these reasons, these disputes arise. But when you dig really deep into his work, and I've tried to do that over the years, and especially in putting together this book, you do see that, number one, his mind was just saturated with scripture. He knew it very, very well. He could quote it easily and often did. He incorporated it into his books, the imagery, the parables, the language, everything. And also, beyond the language, the themes were very important to him. God's goodness, God's redemption, God's forgiveness, the way that we ought to forgive each other because God has forgiven us, just the need for a savior because we are sinful. Now, he was not a great fan of doctrinal debates, disputes. He didn't like getting into the nitty-gritty of it, but those themes of sin and redemption, they stayed with him, they haunted his mind, they colored his work, and so much of what he thought and said and wrote and believed came out of there.
And so we'll get to that a little bit more shortly too. In fact, I want to press you on that a bit more later. But for starters, again, just so people know, what this book is excerpts of Dickens's work. his novels, his famous ones, his lesser known ones, some short stories. At the end, there's a couple of letters even. He wrote a lot of letters and essays. And so you've taken his work and developed sort of parts that are sort of, you don't want to say the greatest hits because they make it sound sort of silly, but you picked themes that sort of illustrate some of the gospel messages that actually are permeated through his work. So tell us a little about that. I mean, what do you hope readers would get when they read this book? Are you hoping that it'll evangelize them? Are you hoping that they'll just agree that Dickens was a Christian? Is the literature itself transforming? Like what are you hoping at the end of the day when somebody reads your book that they get out of it?
First of all, I hope that at the most basic level, I hope that they see that Dickens was a wonderful writer. I hope that these excerpts are short enough and powerful enough and emphatic enough to help people just sort of start to develop a taste for him, because it's a daunting thing to start reading a classic writer, especially when you don't make a habit of it. And as Karen used this image in her foreword, she said, if you come to Dickens unprepared, it can be a little bit like drinking from a fire hose. And I love that, that it stuck with me because it is so true. So what we hope to do here is just maybe turn that fire hose down a little bit so that you can drink from it easily, sort of develop a taste. And as you're doing that, then to see what drove him, what was in his mind and his heart, why he wrote the way he did and the things he did, and see the themes that were so important to him, his passion to help the poor, his belief in forgiveness and redemption, and his hatred of hypocrisy, his desire that a nation that professed to be a Christian nation should really live up to that ideal, and people learn to treat each other as Christ told us to treat each other. So I want people to see all of this in him. I mean, we can talk all day about, what the specifics of his doctrine, what other doctrines he was interested in, and so forth and so on. But at the end of the day, I want them to see how he really engaged with faith and what aspects of faith appealed to him, permeated his mind, and kept coming through in his writing, and what those things can teach us now.
So it does seem, you've said, alluded to this earlier, that there are some scholars out there, historic biographers and literary critics, that might suggest that really he was not a believer, that religion didn't play much of a role in his writing. It just seems, from what little I know about Dickens, but certainly after reading your excerpts, it's just undeniable, it seems. How could they possibly miss it? So you're sort of serving up some of the best parts that sort of make this case that it's clear that his faith and the faith of a Christian worldview shaped and influenced his writing. So I would hope that if there's any skeptics out there that say, oh, Dickens was one of these writers that really isn't a Christian writer, like Hugo maybe, that he clearly was. But I enjoyed that you just said, most of all, at the very beginning, you hope that they would just enjoy his writing, that he's an artist worth reading. There are many of us, and I may be one of those, I'll admit, that are drawn to more sort of contemporary novelists that speak in a vernacular that is my own. And so I read a postmodern 21st century, writer, and it makes sense to me. It is harder to go back and have communion with the dead. But you say it's worth it. I like that a lot. That's beautiful. Just the other day, I was doing a workshop for some writers. I don't know how I got chosen to do this, but I found myself quoting that famous Hollywood mogul, Golden Meyer, who was asked about a message of a film. And he said, you want a message? Send a telegram.
Right.
I mean, a good art doesn't have a message, really, does it? How do you, as you're telling the book, it's not really that you're looking to say what the message is, because it isn't that he's bluntly a propagandist trying to proselytize people about Christianity, or is he?
Well, first and foremost, he tells the story. He tells the story that's in his heart. and all the things that matter to him then come through within that. And I think if you're telling a good story and you're a good writer, that's what will happen. All the things that concerned him, and Dickens could be very blunt and overt at times. Sometimes he would editorialize a little bit.
Yeah.
He couldn't stop himself almost, because he was just such a passionate person and writer. But his number one concern was using his gifts to tell a good story, and to use that power that he had, but he hoped to use it for the good, because all these things that mattered to him were poured into this story too.
Yeah. You know, you quote one of the letters that he wrote near the end of the book. Almost all of your selections are short stories and excerpts from the famous novels. Many of us know them all, but then there's a few that I hadn't heard of. And so you're really doing some good deep cuts here. It's great. But then at the end, you have a couple of letters. And one of the letters, oh, you know what? I think I'm going to read that later. I'm getting ahead of myself. What I want to do is quote your piece here, where you cite a letter in your introduction. Where is it now? Where you cite a letter to a person that was a little bit skeptical of what he was doing. It was a guy named David McCrae.
Yes, it's in the introduction.
And that is in the introduction, and I have a little
page.
bookmark
I'm just gonna spell out the Roman numeral page XVII.
That's what I wrote down here, and for some reason I wanted to. You probably have it memorized, but oh, I'm looking at Karen's foreword. No wonder. Well, you said that Dickens hated religious hypocrisy, not religion itself. And you said in 1861, he wrote to this Reverend David McCrae, who just kind of wasn't getting it. And so even in Dickens's own day, apparently, some people wondered, are you really religious? You sound so anti-religious at times. And then you quote this letter, which I just think is splendid, that Charles wrote. He says, with a deep sense of my great responsibility always upon me when I exercise my art, one of my most constant and most earnest endeavors has been to exhibit in all my good people some faint reflections of the teachings of our great master, and unostentatiously to lead the writer up to those teachings as the great source of all moral goodness. All my strongest illustrations are derived from the New Testament. All my social abuses are shown to be departures from the Spirit. All my good people are humble and charitable, faithful and forgiving, and over again, I claim them in expressed words as disciples of the founder of our religion. But I must admit that to a man or a woman, they all arise and wash their faces and do not appear unto men to fast. That's a line from Jesus where he says, wash your face and don't make it look like you're being religious. Like just get out there and be an ordinary person. Don't be ostentatious about your own faith. But Dickens here is saying that he made his characters, for good or ill, to somehow be a signal of transcendence or a pointer towards the master.
Right.
He's good at character development, isn't he?
He's wonderful at character development. That's one of his defining characteristics, is his colorful characters and just the life and that he puts into them, often the quirkiness that he puts into them, how eccentric he can make them, but they're always full of life and interesting.
Their names are even funny.
Their names are
There's
great.
even Google things. You Google it if you don't believe me. That have his funniest names listed. I mean, he must have had a sense of humor.
Yes.
We think of him as dour sometimes, I think, but he couldn't have been.
Oh, he was wonderfully funny. Yes, he had a great sense of humor, and I'm actually a bit regretful that I couldn't have just put more funny passages into this book. I did include humor where I could, but many of his passages where he most expresses his faith tend to get a little bit earnest and serious, which makes sense. He often expresses the faith at very pivotal, crucial moments in the story, and when things are serious. But he is such a lively writer, such a funny writer too. And I hope that as people read this book and then maybe dig more into Dickens, that side of him will come out more and more.
Well, let's talk just a little bit about the flow of the book itself. I just think it's fabulous the way you have these chapters and you picked excerpts of Dickens, and I don't want to say you pigeonholed them, but you arrayed them, aligned them in a way that sort of makes a lot of sense. Tell us about the very flow of the table of contents, so to speak. What are the main units that you've used to sort of organize the structure of the book?
Yes, the structure I went with, which is overarching, there are 3 parts to it that I've arranged all the excerpts in, and it sort of followed the Christian themes of fall, redemption, and restoration. So I start off with some passages about sin and its victims, which may have been an unexpected way to start off this book, but I felt like we had, when you're talking about Christianity and Christian themes, you almost have to start there to know what we need to be redeemed from. And then we move into grace and redemption and forgiveness, that section of the book. And then I finished up with a section that's more about the righteous life, what the good life looks like according to Dickens. So that was sort of the restoration part.
Yeah, that is really good. Part 1 is sin and its victims. Some writers, Gina, I think might have just said, let's talk about sin, as if sin is fundamentally only about the human heart and God, that we've sinned against God. But you said sin and sin's victims. Karen, in your chapter on your chapter on the Tale of Two Cities in your book, you say that one of the Christian virtues we learn from Dickens is justice. But there's a sense then, even as Dickens is exploring notions of sin, that sin isn't only against God, but it's against other people, that there's a brokenness. I think we forget that. Maybe the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement is helping us understand that now more than ever, but that sin is not just against God, but it's against other people. And so there's a brokenness to the world that we can rightly call sinful. So that first part I thought was very striking, that you included from Bleak House and of course Oliver Twist, and just some really heavy stuff about the brokenness of the world.
Right. Yes, that's exactly it. He was very concerned with how sin affected other people, because he was so interested in the plight of the poor and how they came to be poor and how they ought to be treated. And he wasn't so much interested in spelling out programs of reform. He just wanted people to open their eyes and look around them and see what was going on out there, and how we ought to be doing something about it, how we ought to be reaching out to help the poor if we're going to call ourselves Christians.
Yeah. You know, we've got a couple of questions that rather than wait to the end, I want to ask now. A few people have highlighted a couple of questions that they've typed in. And one of them is about this very question of characterization that we were hitting just a moment ago. And I'd like to blend this question in to not only who are your favorite characters, Gina and Karen both, like who are the characters that stand out, but then also, do they have virtues or traits, and do they fit into which category in the flow of the book would you put those characters in, so to speak, or do they work their way through the process of sin and redemption and righteous living? So tell us a little about some of the characters you like and how they fit into this theme of transformation through the gospel.
Sure. Karen, would you like to start, and then I'll follow up?
Sure. I think that, of course, Great Expectations is my favorite Dickens novel. So, I'll pull one from there. I love the character of Wemmick, who, I mean, I don't know if he'd be a minor or major character, but Wemmick is so interesting because, he is a clerk, who works at the law office of Jaggers, and so Pip befriends him, and Wemmick is interesting because he reflects something that Dickens saw in our modern age, something sort of new, and that's like a sharp division between our public persona and our private one. And the way that Dickens does this humorously is he just, he depicts Wemmick as living literally in a castle surrounded by a moat, and he is, he's all business at the office and all family and friendly at home. And so in some ways Wemmick is kind of a reflection of some of the worst tendencies of an industrialized, modernized kind of culture, but yet Dickens makes him more human by the end of the story with his, not only with, he takes care of his his aged parent, and then ends up marrying a young lady, and it's very, very humorous and sweet, and it's a great example of how Dickens takes a minor character and reflects so much about the society around him, but also just so much about human nature. So he's probably one of my favorites.
Gina, this is the moment. We're waiting. Of all the characters you wrote about in here, what's one or two that were your favorite, and what did they have to teach us?
Well, and some of my friends who may be watching will probably already know this, but I'm a great fan of Sidney Carton in A Tale of Two Cities, who starts out very unpromisingly and becomes an absolute hero by the end of the book. He plays a redemptive role, and yet first he has to be redeemed himself, and he has some beautiful redemptive moments, and it just, his whole character arc and his whole story really shows the power of faith and what faith and love can inspire us to do for other people. A couple of others, I'm very fond of Aunt Betsy Trotwood and David Copperfield. She also starts out a little unpromisingly. She's quite intimidating, seemingly strict, and yet she turns out to be one of the most loving, most affectionate characters that you could ever find. And but always just unique, completely unique, always chasing donkeys off her front lawn, so quite territorial, just full of quirks, very eccentric but very loving. And another favorite of mine is Jenny Wren from Our Mutual Friend, who is very young. I'm not sure exactly what her age is supposed to be, probably no more than maybe 12, 13, 14, but in Dickens, and this was a reflection of his own hard childhood, you often get children who are too old for their years, and she may be one of the most extreme examples. She has to take care of herself, she has to deal with a disability, and she has to take care of a drunken father as well. But with it all, she is so funny, she is so shrewd, she has, and it's interesting, she has moments of almost mysticism, and yet she comes right back down to earth and is very funny and shrewd and down to earth again. And so there's so much contrast in her character, but also so much wit and wisdom and
you have a selection called Troublesome Bad Child from Our Mutual Friend, and it's about Jenny Wren.
Yes.
The excerpts you put in here are so good, and maybe I didn't say this earlier, but like some of the other books in this series, there are sort of in italics, an annotation in the beginning that sort of sets the stage for why you picked this particular reading. So it sets the table for what you're sort of, I don't want to say supposed to get out of it, that's a little trivial, but you do kind of give us a clue to where it sits in the plot of the story, what story it's from, of course, and then why you chose it. And so those italics portions that you wrote are themselves worth the price of the book. I mean, it's better than a Cliff Notes, but you're offering wisdom and insight and guidance. It's not sort of cheating to do this. Karen, you've written in Plough and in the foreword here that it is sort of like drinking from a fire hose, as Gina said. Why don't I just read that very portion? This is the first paragraph. I don't know if writers like it when other people read their books, but I don't want to put you on the spot, so I'll read it. It says, good literature is fresh water for the soul. While some writers offer a sip ladled from the well, Dickens takes us to a mountain waterfall where washing waters saturate, overwhelm, and put us at the risk of drowning as we drink. But fear not. This book of selected readings is more like a gentle brook whose waters will quench the thirst of Dickens' fans and neophytes alike. And I couldn't say the word. And I know this volume will attract those who know and love Dickens already, but I hope it woos those who have yet to drink from his depths. You hope it'll woo those who have yet to drink from his depths. Tell us a little bit about how to do that. If you're not a aficionado, if you're not a fan, if you don't know his work real well, where do you begin and how do you do it?
Well, of course, this book is a great beginning. And you know, for anyone who's really worried about spoilers, I mean, I wouldn't worry about that because Dickens novels are so Byzantine and maze-like. There's so many things that happen and so many characters, and some the way his sentences end sometimes are just surprises in themselves. So I do think that this book is an excellent way to just taste Dickens and maybe to see which particular work interests you the most, because there is quite a variety. I mean, Great Expectations is very different from A Tale of Two Cities for a lot of reasons. But the other just sort of thing that I would say about any of the novels that you might pick up, and they are, as Gina already mentioned, I mean, most of them are quite thick and long. So it is a commitment. But this is a reminder I offer so many times in my classes and on podcasts for people who aren't used to reading older classical literature. Read slowly. It's not a race, and you really do. You need to read works like this almost like it's poetry, and you need to enjoy the words, the sentence structure, the vocabulary. And another quality of Dickens that I don't think we've brought up yet is that there's so much in his voice and tone. His work is very dialogical in the sense that he may be saying something ironically or sarcastically or in the voice of a character. There are a multitude of voices in the novel, and you have to give yourself time to adjust to that and realize that Dickens isn't, his narrators aren't always just a straight man. There are nuances in tone and voice and humor, and so just to just read slowly and immersively, and don't treat it like a race.
Karen, do you have one that you would recommend that people start with after they've read Gina's book and they look at some of the ones that she's recommending, the excerpts? But is there a kind of a go-to that you'd say start with?
Mm-hmm. I would say, again, depending on interest, I would say either Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, or A Tale of Two Cities, even though they're very different. I think those are works that most people are somewhat familiar with, even just from film versions or whatever, and that can be a help to just kind of have that familiarity.
What would you say, Gina?
Those would also be on my list as some of the shorter ones. and I'm just being very practical here. I mean, A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations happen to be two of my own favorites. Oliver Twist is also very good, but also I think it helps to just be able to get into a shorter one first before you wade out into, say, the deeper water. Hard Times is also a little bit shorter than some of the others, and it's sort of an overlooked one, but I'm rather fond of it myself. I think there's a lot of good stuff in it, so maybe that one. I think if somebody wanted to get into one of the bigger ones, David Copperfield is probably a good one to start with there. It's just, I think the story for Dickens is relatively easy to follow. Just this coming of age story of David from when he's born, as he grows up and encounters all sorts of characters. And I think it's one of the easier ones to follow and has so many great characters in it. And Little Dorrit is also a good one because, for one thing, there was a great TV adaptation a few years ago of that one that lots of people saw. And so I think that one there may be that familiarity too with that one, that people can get into it a little more easily. And it also happens to be one of my favorites.
One of the questioners asked if any one of the stories, and I'm not sure what you're going to say to this, but if any one of the stories seems to be the most overtly Christian, or where redemptive themes are most evident. Like if somebody wants to say, okay, I really want to read sort of at his Christian best, so to speak. Is there one over some of the others where the themes of faith are more obvious?
Karen, would you like to take that one and then I'll follow
Yeah,
up again?
yeah. I mean, because Gina, really, I've not read as many more works of Dickens than I have read. So I'll say A Tale of Two Cities, I think, is probably the most obvious one that has like a Christ figure and just a very dramatic thread of redemption.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm inclined to mention that one too. And also Great Expectations with Pip's sort of fall from grace and recognition that he needs to be redeemed, and as he does so, helping others around him to be redeemed as well. And maybe also Bleak House. I think there are some things in there that point very clearly to Christianity.
I didn't even think to ask this earlier, but I was just sort of wondering if you were to add up the contributions in here from each of the novels, is there any one of them that's in here more often than the others?
I think I quoted pretty extensively from A Tale of Two Cities and also from David Copperfield. There were times when, and it was a little tricky sometimes to figure out how to do this right, but there were times when I sort of tried to take a storyline and without going overboard to sort of follow it through. And sometimes you'll see there's a piece of a particular plot line in one section and then another piece in the next section. Yeah. So you can sort of follow it through the book and so you can sort of follow a redemptive arc with a few of these. But in order to do that, I had to put significant parts of the book in. So yes, there are some that I quote more than others.
It's just a brilliant idea. It's so good. Were there any pieces you wanted to put in that maybe just didn't fit, or any beloved sections you thought, well, if I do another volume, I'll put those in?
Perhaps. As I was saying earlier, I sort of wished I could have put more of the funny parts in, more of the, I don't know, just some of the livelier parts. But I did get little bits of that sometimes, like with, sometimes I think I got a bit of that with the Cratchit family from A Christmas Carol, and the part with Jenny from our mutual friend who I mentioned before is fairly lively. So I tried to get a little bit of a mix there.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say A Christmas Carol. A Christmas Carol would be, to answer two questions, it would be a great place for anyone to start. And especially if you are familiar with the story, because reading it really is a different experience. Like you can know the story, you can know the broad story and outlines, but still just be delighted and surprised at Dickens' language if you haven't read it. And then of course that story I think is the gospel.
Yeah.
So
we don't have to look down our noses if the Christmas Carol is your favorite one.
That's right.
Good stuff, right?
It's beautiful.
That's right.
Do you read it some Advent seasons? Do you read it every year?
I do tend to do that, yes. I also watch a couple of the movie adaptations.
You're a movie lover too, aren't you?
Sorry?
You're a movie lover too, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
You
And
write
I'm very
culture blog.
I'm very fond of a number of different adaptations. I'm fond of the Alastair Sim adaptation of A Christmas Carol, and also the Muppet Christmas Carol. I love it. And you wouldn't have guessed, but they actually get quite a lot of Dickens wording in there, perhaps more than other adaptations, because they have a narrator. So it really is quite touching and quite impressive how faithful the Muppet version is to Dickens. I really love that they did that.
I'd like to ask two questions that have come in from the audience. Neither are exactly anything we've touched about yet, but I'll try to frame them a little bit because they're good questions, and I know the people that ask them, as a matter of fact. Here's one of them. Let's ask this. We hear a bit, and Karen, in your book where you talk about Tale of Two Cities, you talk about the virtue of justice. We hear a bit about how Dickens was attentive to the difficulties of the industrial age, the child labor, the poverty, the injustices, the greed, the hypocritical churches. And so he was a prophet, an Old Testament prophet, if you will, railing against the injustices. It's interesting, my friend Steve Garber mentioned, and I never thought of this before, but he lived at the same time and in the same city as Karl Marx. They both looked out at the injustices of this awful city, and they came up with very different stories to tell about what the problems were and what should be done about them. Marx read Dickens, by the way. So how much do you have to know about the political scene of London in the Victorian era? Like, do you need to know some of that to appreciate Dickens? Was he a political figure? Other than the sort of moral outrage against the poor and child labor, but did he have sort of political leanings? He was an Anglican. Was he? Where did he stand in the kind of social scene of the day?
Well, I when I read works of literature like this, politics is the farthest thing from my mind, and that's a good thing. So I would say, he was a progressive in his time. And I think the thing that would be most important to kind of know and understand that I find very moving when I read Dickens is to realize that, as you said, Byron, he was a prophet. To realize that he was writing in an age that was just starting to begin to think that perhaps if you were born poor or born in some other oppressed class, you didn't have to stay that way, that you could change your condition, and that people were just starting to think that maybe if I am a Christian and maybe if I have wealth and means, I could and should help people. Like, those were radical new ideas in that time, because for hundreds and hundreds of years of existence in England and Europe, it was just kind of accepted that whatever you were born, whatever your class or station you were, that's how you stayed. And so when we read Dickens now, some of what he says, well, of course we shouldn't, starve children and put them in orphanages and this or that. Well, Dickens was what he was a prophetic voice, as Gina said earlier, asking people to see what was right in front of them, but that they could not really see until they read Dickens.
What would have he thought kind of about other countries? He came to the United States a time or two. One questioner said, if he were alive today, what would he think of Brexit? That's sort of a curious question. What might have he thought about Brexit if he were here today?
That's hard to say. I mean, there were certain, as Karen said, he was quite a progressive in his day. There were certain things where he was a very radical voice. At the same time, in some ways he was a little bit traditional. I can't say for certain what he would have thought about Brexit or other modern issues. I can say that the Dickens family today is they're very there are many members of the family. He had I believe 10 children and multiple grandchildren. And today he has so many like great grandchildren. Some of them are writers, actors, artists, activists, doing all kinds of things. They're a very interesting family. I've spoken with some of them before and enjoyed it. And so you see, sometimes you see some of them out there saying Dickens probably would have voted to stay in the European Union, or other things that he might have said and thought. And as members of his family, they probably have, they probably have a fairly decent idea of what he might have done. But because he isn't here now, we can't say with 100% certainty. We can only say we know he would. We know what things he was concerned about. We know where he thought things ought to change, and sometimes maybe where they ought to stay the same. For instance, he tended to get upset about like public obscenity on the streets, things like that. So in some ways he was surprisingly a little bit conservative. Yeah. But we can guess, and we can know that what concerned him, but we can't say with absolute certainty.
Karen, you wrote a book on Hannah More, poet and writer, novelist, friends of William Wilberforce from a previous generation. Mm-hmm. Would have Dickens known her writing?
Yeah, he would have known at least her religious writings, probably. I don't know if he would have read her novel, but one of the things that I argue in my book and my dissertation that it's based on is that Hannah More's single novel that she wrote actually sort of predicts and sets a template for the kinds of things that Dickens did with his characters and his addressing social problems by using the novel as a form. So their lives would have overlapped a little bit, and she was, a best-selling writer in her time. So I'm sure he read her.
It's so interesting to think of somebody like Dickens reading Hannah More, or Karl Marx reading Dickens.
Yeah.
Gina, you wrote another book on another publishing house about Dorothy Sayers and St. Jack C.S. Lewis, Dorothy and Jack. Did Dorothy or Jack read Dickens?
Yes, they did, and they were quite fond of him. There were times when they critiqued him, but then there were lots of times when they praised him also. Lewis is widely quoted as saying, and I hope I can remember this correctly, you can't get a book long enough or a cup of tea big enough to suit me, something like that. And it's reported that the book he was holding when he said it was Bleak House. So, so there you go.
Knew that. Oh, that's great.
And Sayers, she scatters allusions to Dickens all throughout her books. Lord Peter Wimsey's car is named Mrs. Myrtle, for instance, who is a character in Little Dorrit, because it's a very quiet car, and Mrs. Myrtle was a person who wanted a very quiet and smooth life. So yes, they were both very well versed in Dickens and fond of him.
Karen, was there any parts of Gina's book, as you looked through it and saw the excerpts that she was putting in, that you said, well, why didn't she put this in there? From your knowledge, now you say she knows more about Dickens than you do, but was there any parts of it that you were sort of surprised to see? Like, oh, I didn't expect that in there.
Well, I mean, there are a couple of things. One thing is what I first read was just like a Word document or something. And then when I got this in the mail just a few days ago, I was delighted to see some of the illustrations in the book. I didn't know those were going to be in there. Good call, Plough, Gina. And I just thought that Gina really included such a wide range of Dickens writings. There are so many that are lesser known, and she managed to get those in. So I was just impressed that you pulled from so many, and yet still represented some of the better known favorite ones well. Great job.
Thank you.
It's just a splendid book, and really useful in the way for those of us that aren't Dickens fans, that it really does seem to work like that. There's another question that came in from our audience scattered throughout North America here. And it's something we need to talk about, although we're focusing on his literature and not necessarily his life. But you're making the claim that in his literature, the gospel of Christ weaves throughout, that it's part of the fabric of his worldview, and his stories come out and often talk about Christian faith. I don't want to talk about his doctrine or his faith experience, but his personal life in terms of his marriage. One question said that he maybe had a mistress. So there's been different stories about that said. Most people have heard something about that. Could you tell us just a little bit about his own situation there? And then maybe if that comes out in any of the books, his view of marriage or divorce or abuse or faithfulness or any of that sort of stuff.
Yes. He he had what can only be called a midlife crisis, as we would tend to put it today. His marriage seemed to have been a little bit unhappy for some time before that. And there was a difference in temperament. Dickens was an enormously energetic person, the sort of person who could walk, I think maybe he would go out in the middle of the night and walk all over London. He could walk 30 miles at a go. It was just always throwing parties, always being the life of the party, always just bursting with energy. His wife, Catherine, was something of the opposite, I believe. And perhaps not surprisingly for a woman who had borne 10 children, she, as the years went on, she had more and more difficulty keeping up with him. I sometimes wonder if anybody could have kept up with him. And as he got to middle age, I think there were a lot of forces playing on him. I think there was some depression. I think there were some lingering leftover difficulties from his childhood. I've actually just been reading up on some of this, and it's interesting stuff. There's a book I was just reading by Gwen Watkins. It's a little bit Freudian, but it was very good. Just about how some of the bad treatment from his family over the years when he was a child just stayed with him and was never resolved. All of which is to say that he did sort of have mental, emotional blow up in midlife, ended up essentially ending his marriage, not divorcing as it was such a scandalous thing in those days, but separating from Catherine and taking up with a young woman, an actress named Ellen Ternan. And all that I've said up to now about his difficulties and his depression is not to excuse him, because he did behave very badly. I think what we can say is that he knew he had behaved very badly. He tried to brazen it out, was not always quite successful with that. There are times that are reported when he confided to his daughter Mamie. He confided to Angela Burdett Coutts, I think that was her name, a good friend of his. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He confessed now and then to various people that he knew he had done wrong. He knew he was in need of forgiveness. He was not always able to admit that publicly, but he knew it privately. I think it did prey on him. And the most we can say for him is that he, just like some of the people he railed against, he did not always live up to his own beliefs and his own standards. And he stood in as great need of forgiveness as perhaps any of his characters. And he knew that. And I think perhaps that's one reason why he continued to hunger for the truths of the gospel. In Great Expectations, for instance, which is a book that he wrote after all this had happened, he has a young protagonist, Pip, who behaves very badly, deals with guilt, needs redemption, and those themes are there. And I think it's true that he knew he needed them as much as anybody else ever could.
Well, that's poignant stuff, that his own life reflected the need for the very thing he wrote about. That's a nice way of putting it, and I appreciate that. Yeah. Karen, any additions about your sense of his own journey in life, his own ups and downs. His need for redemption.
Gina put it very well. The only thing I might add is that, about the strength of characters is he's often described as almost like of killing himself, or his audience killing him, because he so exhausted himself going around and doing public readings and traveling. And so I think he probably had, a big ego. And, I mean, some people have no reason to have a big ego, and some people do, and he did. But he really just wore himself out, and so there's sort of a tragedy to that as well.
And he is buried in that great cathedral there, right, with so many other famous writers there in London.
Yes. Right.
You mentioned his travels. This is sort of silly. It shows the level of scholarship I bring to things, which isn't much. Here's my contribution. When he came to the United States the first time, he was on a train from Baltimore to go to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I mentioned that our store is in South Central Pennsylvania. Our bookstore is in Dallastown, but the nearest town near us, Gina, you went to college down here, so you know this, is
That's
York,
right.
Pennsylvania, where they used to make York peppermint patties. Well, Dickens came to York, which is how far the train came. He got out and he had a meal. And it is said in our historical society, at least, that he claims that he had the best beefsteak he ever had in his life in York, Pennsylvania.
That's
and then
saying
he
a
wanted to
lot for
continue to
English.
Harrisburg, but there was no train. So he went on a horse-bound carriage, a stagecoach, and they stopped in a little town called Goldsboro, the other side of the river from where 3 Mile Island is. And he commented on how beautiful the Susquehanna River was. And then he continued on to Harrisburg.
Wow.
I think he later wrote a book about his trip to America, and he didn't say much very pleasant about it. But according to our records, he liked York and he liked the Susquehanna River. And so there you have it. He came to York, Pennsylvania. I bet you guys can't say that about your hometown. Did he ever visit York, Virginia?
He did visit Washington, D.C. I know that.
You live near Washington?
About a half an hour from.
Okay, good. See, we share that. We have this common experience of having stood in the places that maybe Dickens almost stood. Well,
Right.
I think we need to kind of close this up. Here's what I'd like to do. Gina, it's customary to ask writers to read from their work, but you were collating and curating and selecting work for us. So I don't know if you need to read Dickens, but there's that letter at the end. We talked about this the other day. There's this letter at the end that he wrote to one of his children when his children was moving to Australia. Could you read just a little portion of that where he talks about giving his kid a Bible and stuff? I think it clarifies for us what from his own words he himself was saying to his own children. It's kind of nice. Do you want to read that?
Sure. I need to put my glasses on for this. Yes, as you say, this is at the end of the book. This is to his son, Edward, whose nickname was Plough. I'm not sure where that came from. But it's the thing to sort of listen for here is something that we've already mentioned, that he loved Jesus Christ. He didn't always love the church. Sometimes he went a little bit far with that. But he wants his son to focus on the Bible and to focus on the Christ of the Bible and not get distracted from that. And so you'll see that emphasis in this passage. I put a New Testament among your books for the very same reasons and with the very same hopes that made me write an easy account of it for you when you were a little child, because it is the best book that ever was or will be known in the world, and because it teaches you the best lessons by which any human creature who tries to be truthful and faithful to duty can possibly be guided. As your brothers have gone away one by one, I have written to each such words as I am now writing to you, and have entreated them all to guide themselves by this book, putting aside the interpretations and inventions of man. You will remember that you have never at home been wearied about religious observances or mere formalities. I have always been anxious not to weary my children with such things before they are old enough to form opinions respecting them. You will therefore understand the better that I now most solemnly impress upon you the truth and beauty of the Christian religion, as it came from Christ himself, and the impossibility of your going far wrong if you humbly but heartily respect it. Only one thing more on this head: the more we are in earnest as to feeling it, the less we are disposed to hold forth about it. Never abandon the wholesome practice of saying your own private prayers night and morning. I have never abandoned it myself, and I know the comfort of it. I hope you will always be able to say in afterlife that you had a kind father. You cannot show your affection for him so well or make him so happy as by doing your duty, your affectionate father.
Isn't that sweet?
Yes, it really is.
He experiences the comfort of prayer.
Mhm,
He wants him to focus on the New Testament, which is the best book ever written, he says.
mhm.
I think Plough Publishing captures some of that with their Anabaptist focus on the person of Jesus and living well in the world. I just applaud Plough for this whole series. And Gina, we congratulate you for the hard work you did on this book.
Thank you.
Everybody at home should lift a toast and be grateful to you and celebrate this book launching out into the world. Let's pray that it makes its way into bookstores, into Barnes and Noble, into great review places, that people will read it and grapple with it and learn to love good literature, learn to love Dickens, and maybe learn to love the very Jesus that he loved. That would be a great, great hope and prayer. So Karen, we thank you for joining us. The foreword is great. Your article in Plough is great. Your chapter on Dickens in your own book is great. So we're grateful for your role as a scholar of literature to join us tonight. But Gina, you are the star of the moment and our hats are off to you. We salute you for this good project and we thank you very, very much. So I'd like to say good night to you both and thank you for joining us. The book is available for sale at Hearts and Minds Bookstore and hopefully other bookstores as well. You could probably buy it from Amazon, although Dickens and Gina and Karen and I all know the value of independent bookstores and not necessarily going to the easiest place. So we would invite you to get it wherever you get your books and preferably at some independent bookstore. Some of you are going to get some free ones. We called out your name earlier. We hope you get your free ones from Plough, and we hope you can place an order for Hearts and Minds if you'd like to get them from us. We thank Plough Publishing for doing good books. We thank them for hosting this event. And we thank you, Beth and I, from Hearts and Minds, near York, Pennsylvania, the town that Charles Dickens had the best beefsteak. That's what we've learned tonight, ladies and gentlemen. There's some fun stuff in Charles Dickens and some wonderfully profound stuff as well. We hope that this very book, The Gospel in Dickens, I'll show you one more time. And we thank you very much for your pleasure of joining us tonight. Good evening.